Imagine stepping onto a flight, hoping for nothing more than a peaceful journey, only to find yourself mocked, mistreated, and treated like you don't belong, just because of your skin color, your age, and your weakness. This is exactly what happened to Rosalind Mercer, a 79-year-old black woman, frail but dignified, who boarded Flight 407 with nothing but a simple walker and the desire to reach her destination. She had no idea that she was about to be thrown into the most humiliating experience of her life, all thanks to Heather Vaughn, a flight attendant who saw her not as a human being, but as an inconvenience, an eyesore, someone unworthy of respect. From the moment Rosalind stepped onto the plane, Heather made it her mission to tear her down, using every trick in the book, subtle insults, public humiliation, and outright cruelty, all while hiding behind the fake politeness of her uniform. The worst part? No one stopped her. Other passengers, some uncomfortable, some entertained, watched it happen and said nothing. Because to them, this wasn't shocking. It was just another old, black woman being put in her place. But what Heather didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Rosalind Mercer was not just any old woman. And by the time the plane landed, Heather would realize that the person she spent the entire flight degrading was the one woman she should have never messed with. What happens when cruelty meets justice? When power flips in an instant? You're about to witness one of the most brutal twists of fate ever caught on camera. Before we get into it, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more jaw-dropping stories, and comment below. Asterisk, asterisk, where are you watching from? And what do you think should happen to Heather? Let us know. Now, let's dive into this unbelievable story. The afternoon sun gleamed off the sleek exterior of Flight 407 as passengers trickled toward the boarding gate. The atmosphere was a mixture of anticipation and quiet urgency, travelers eager to reach their destinations. Among them was Rosalind Mercer, a frail, elderly woman who clutched her walker with delicate fingers. Her movements were slow but deliberate, each step a testament to her determination. The world had never been particularly kind to the weak, and today would be no exception. As she approached the entrance of the plane, her weary eyes scanned the staircase leading up to the cabin door. A simple climb for most, but for her, it was a mountain. She hesitated, shifting slightly as she steadied herself. The gate attendant, a young man with a polite but detached demeanor, barely glanced at her as he gestured for the next passenger to move forward. From inside the cabin, Heather Vaughn leaned casually against the doorway, arms crossed, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her sleeve. Her sharp blue eyes locked onto Rosalind, a flicker of irritation flashing across her face. Another one of them, the ones who slowed everything down, who made simple tasks a chore for everyone else. Rosalind took the first step, gripping the railing tightly. The effort made her breath shallow, her arms trembling slightly under the weight of her own body. Heather rolled her eyes and turned toward Mia Sanchez, a junior flight attendant who stood nearby. "Are we really going to hold up the entire boarding process for that?" Heather muttered under her breath. Mia hesitated, her brows furrowing as she looked at Rosalind. "She looks like she could use some help," Mia said softly. Heather scoffed. "And I look like a personal nurse? She should have stayed home if she can't even get on a plane by herself." Rosalind managed another step before her foot wobbled slightly. The walker wasn't designed for stairs, and the uneven footing made her progress painfully slow. The couple behind her shuffled impatiently, whispering among themselves. Heather, exasperated, raised her voice just enough to be heard by the surrounding passengers. "Ma'am, if you can't get on the plane, perhaps you should consider alternative transportation. We can't delay takeoff because of a single person." Rosalind paused, blinking as her face burned with shame. The words hit her harder than they should have, but she had heard them before. Too slow, too weak, in the way. Mia, clearly uncomfortable, took a step forward. "I can help her up." Heather held up a hand, cutting her off. "We have a schedule to keep. You want to stop the entire line for one passenger? Let's be practical." She then turned back to Rosalind, her voice dripping with insincerity. "Would you like me to call for assistance? They might be able to get you up here before midnight." A few passengers chuckled under their breath. Rosalind tightened her grip on her walker, her lips pressing together. She had spent her entire life refusing to be a burden, and yet, here she was again, being reduced to one. A man in his 40s sighed loudly behind her. "For God's sake, can someone carry her up? I have a connection to make." Heather smirked. "See? Even the passengers agree. Efficiency is key." She turned back to Mia. "You want to be a hero? Be my guest, but don't slow the rest of us down." Mia hesitated, torn between her instinct to help and the unspoken hierarchy that Heather commanded. She stepped back reluctantly, her expression one of quiet defeat. Rosalind finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll manage." Heather raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Suit yourself." Rosalind resumed her slow ascent, step by agonizing step, as murmurs of impatience swirled around her. When she finally reached the top, she exhaled shakily, her knuckles white from gripping the railing. Heather gave a slow, sarcastic clap. "Congratulations, you made it. Now, let's get moving before we all die of old age." A fresh wave of laughter rippled through the crowd. Rosalind swallowed hard, blinking back the sting in her eyes. She refused to let them see her break. As she stepped inside the cabin, Heather leaned toward Mia once more, her voice just loud enough for Rosalind to hear. "Honestly, she should have just taken a train. Would have been faster." Rosalind kept her head down and moved forward, her heart heavy. She hadn't even taken her seat yet, and already, the flight felt unbearably long. Rosalind Mercer had barely settled her trembling fingers around the armrest when Heather Vaughn swept in, her presence sharp and unwelcome like a cold gust of wind. With a sigh of exaggerated exasperation, Heather snatched Rosalind's boarding pass from her fragile grip, scanning it quickly before clicking her tongue disapprovingly. "Oh no, this won't do," she muttered, shaking her head. "There's been a mistake." She paused just long enough for the nearby passengers to perk up in mild curiosity, their gazes flickering toward the frail old woman who already seemed out of place in the premium cabin. "Ma'am," Heather continued, her voice taking on that syrupy condescension reserved for speaking to children and the elderly, "this seat isn't suitable for you after all. We need to move you somewhere safer." Rosalind blinked in confusion. She had double-checked her ticket before boarding. This was her assigned seat. Her mind raced, wondering if she had misread something. "But my seat," she started, her voice barely above a whisper, but Heather was already walking away, rolling her walker toward the back of the plane. "Follow me, dear," Heather called over her shoulder. Rosalind's face burned as she struggled to stand, gripping the armrest tightly for support. She could feel the impatient stares of the passengers around her, silently willing her to move faster. Just as she took a step forward, Heather stopped abruptly near the emergency exit row, her lips curling into a smirk as an idea took shape in her mind. She spun around and gestured grandly toward the vacant seats. "Actually, this might be perfect for you," she announced, loud enough for others to hear. Rosalind hesitated, her frail body still leaning on the seat for balance. Heather turned to the surrounding passengers, as if including them in a private joke. "You see, in case of an emergency, the people sitting here need to be able to assist with evacuations." She paused dramatically, tapping a manicured finger against her lips before shrugging. Obviously, that wouldn't work in this case, but at least if something did happen, no one would have to carry extra weight. A few chuckles rippled through the nearby seats. A man in a business suit shifted uncomfortably in his chair, glancing at Rosalind before quickly averting his eyes. Rosalind swallowed hard, her throat dry. She wanted to protest, to ask for her original seat back, but Heather's bright, expectant gaze was fixed on her, daring her to argue. With slow, reluctant movements, Rosalind lowered herself into the emergency row seat, the leather cold beneath her thin frame. Heather beamed, clapping her hands together. "Much better," she chirped before leaning down, her voice lowering into something almost intimate. "And this way, if we do crash, no one has to trip over you while trying to escape." She straightened and turned back toward the aisle, already moving on to her next task. Rosalind stared straight ahead, her hands trembling in her lap. The embarrassment was suffocating. Heather reappeared moments later, seatbelt in hand. "Let's get you buckled in properly," she announced. Rosalind reached for the belt, her fingers unsteady as she tried to fasten it herself, but Heather clicked her tongue. "Oh no, let me help," she insisted, yanking it from Rosalind's hands. "We wouldn't want you getting tangled up, now would we?" Rosalind flinched as Heather jerked the seatbelt across her lap, snapping it into place with unnecessary force. The belt pressed harshly against her abdomen, making it difficult to breathe. Heather gave a satisfied nod before suddenly reaching down and yanking the buckle open again, causing the strap to snap back against Rosalind's waist. "Oh dear," Heather gasped, placing a hand over her chest in mock concern. "I guess it wouldn't have helped you much anyway. If the plane goes down, well..." She trailed off with a smirk, leaving the sentence unfinished but the implication clear. A few passengers nearby exchanged uneasy glances. One woman looked as though she wanted to say something, but she merely shifted uncomfortably in her seat instead. Heather patted Rosalind's shoulder lightly, her fingers lingering just long enough to feel patronizing rather than comforting. "Try to sit still, dear," she advised, her voice thick with false sweetness. "We wouldn't want you slipping out of the seat during takeoff." A chuckle came from a row behind them, low and mean-spirited. Rosalind's chest tightened as she fought the burning in her eyes. She refused to cry. "Not here. Not now." Heather, pleased with herself, finally stepped back, giving a dramatic stretch as if she had just performed a strenuous act of charity. "All set here," she called to the other attendants. "Let's just hope we don't hit turbulence. I don't think she'll be holding on too tight." Another burst of laughter followed, but Heather had already turned on her heel, striding away without another glance at Rosalind. As the plane continued to fill with passengers, the humiliation lingered like a weight on Rosalind's chest. She forced herself to breathe evenly, staring at the seat in front of her. This was just a flight, a few hours of endurance. She had survived worse. But as she sat there, her seatbelt still unfastened, her hands gripping the armrests as if to anchor herself, she couldn't shake the creeping realization that this was only the beginning. Rosalind's face devoid of expression, but her mind reeling with humiliation as passengers settled into their seats around her. She could still hear the faint snickers from earlier, the low murmurs of amusement at her expense, and the suffocating weight of being reduced to nothing more than an inconvenience. Heather, moving fluidly through the aisle with a practiced grace, made sure to stop just near Rosalind, her eyes sweeping over the elderly woman as if evaluating whether she was still worth tormenting. Her lips curled slightly as she leaned down toward the man sitting next to Rosalind, a middle-aged businessman who had barely glanced at her since taking his seat. "I just want to give you a heads up," Heather whispered, her voice low but pointed. "She might need a little extra time getting out of her seat if you need to use the restroom or stretch your legs. You know how it is." The businessman blinked, his attention now fully on the frail woman beside him. Heather tilted her head sympathetically, though her tone was anything but. "I'd hate for you to feel stuck here for the entire flight. If you want, I can see if there's another seat available for you somewhere less restrictive." The businessman hesitated for a moment, eyeing Rosalind with newfound discomfort, shifting slightly as if already feeling trapped. Rosalind remained silent, her fingers tightening their grip on the armrest as she stared straight ahead, her throat closing up with a familiar ache of being unwanted. Heather didn't stop there. She straightened and moved down the aisle, stopping by another row where a couple sat comfortably, already immersed in conversation. "Just between us," Heather murmured conspiratorially, her voice carrying the light, amused tone of a gossip. "Can you believe they put her in an emergency row? I mean, no offense, but I'd be a little nervous if something actually happened. I don't think she's exactly quick response material, if you know what I mean." The woman of the pair gave a quiet chuckle, nudging her companion. "Maybe they expect us to carry her out instead," she quipped, earning a smirk from Heather. "Let's just say I wouldn't count on any heroic rescues from that seat," Heather said with a wink before moving on, leaving behind just enough of a planted seed to spread unease throughout the nearby rows. The tension was subtle but real, a few more glances cast toward Rosalind, A few more hushed exchanges between passengers, each one chipping away at her dignity in a way that was small enough to go unnoticed, but deliberate enough to sting. Rosalind exhaled shakily, her chest tightening as she forced herself to maintain composure. She had survived a lifetime of indignities, of people speaking over her, of people dismissing her worth, and yet it never got easier. The feeling of being less than clung to her skin like a heavy weight, and the worst part was that Heather knew exactly how to wield it against her. When Heather returned, it was with the same smirk, the same casual cruelty in her expression as she leaned down again, this time closer, her voice sickly sweet. "Are we comfortable, dear?" she asked, tilting her head. Rosalind, still unwilling to engage, simply nodded. Heather sighed, tapping a manicured nail against the seat in front of her, as if considering something. I was just thinking," she said, voice pitched just high enough for those nearby to overhear. "If you needed to use the restroom during the flight, it might be a little difficult for you to get there in time." Her eyes flicked down toward the walker, the implication clear. "I'm sure we could accommodate, but it's just a logistical nightmare, you understand. Perhaps it would have been easier if you'd planned ahead." Rosalind stiffened, a cold flush of dread washing over her. She hadn't even considered the issue of needing the restroom, but now that it had been brought up, the anxiety set in immediately. She hated relying on others for help, hated feeling like a burden. But Heather had made it clear that any request for assistance would be met with nothing but disdain. Heather smiled at the silence, reveling in the power she held over the situation. "But don't worry," she continued, her voice lowering in mock reassurance. "If the worst happens, I'm sure we can figure something out. Accidents happen, right?" The breath caught in Rosalind's throat. The implied humiliation was enough to make her stomach churn. A passenger sitting nearby cleared his throat uncomfortably, shifting in his seat as if the conversation had suddenly become too cruel even for him. Heather, however, seemed unfazed. She straightened and gave a little shrug, dusting off her hands. "Just something to think about," she said airily before turning away, satisfied that she had planted yet another fear in Rosalind's mind. The elderly woman sat frozen in place, hands clenched in her lap, every muscle in her frail body wound tight with the effort of holding herself together. She had known humiliation before, had been overlooked, dismissed, ignored. But this was something else. Heather wasn't just ignoring her. She was actively chipping away at her dignity piece by piece, and there was nothing Rosalind could do to stop it. Heather moved through the cabin with the same calculated ease, every glance, every movement deliberate, ensuring that Rosalind remained the focal point of subtle amusement and open ridicule. The elderly woman remained still in her seat, hands locked together, her body rigid, as if any small movement would only invite more humiliation. Heather thrived on that silence, on the way Rosalind's knuckles whitened against the armrest, on the small, barely perceptible tremors in her frail fingers. She had broken plenty of people before, but there was something particularly satisfying about breaking someone who had already spent a lifetime being overlooked. Heather stopped beside her again, tapping her fingers on the edge of the seat, ensuring that the attention of the surrounding passengers lingered. She mused, voice deliberately light. "I just had a thought. We have some very strict regulations about animals on board. Service dogs, emotional support pets. There are all kinds of rules about how they need to be transported properly." She let her words hang in the air just long enough to make sure people were listening, then tilted her head slightly, her eyes locking onto Rosalind's hunched frame. "I just wonder," she continued, feigning curiosity, "if anyone's ever tried to buy a first-class ticket for an old dog. Do you think they'd let it sit here with the rest of us?" A ripple of awkward laughter flickered through the cabin, hesitant at first, then growing bolder as Heather turned toward a young woman in a designer coat who had been watching the exchange with thinly veiled amusement. "What do you think?" Heather asked, her grin widening. We accommodate all kinds of passengers, don't we?" The young woman smirked but quickly turned her attention back to her phone, unwilling to openly engage, but also unwilling to protest. Rosalind's breath hitched in her throat, the weight of the words sinking deep. lodging itself in the same place that years of quiet disregard had carved out inside her. She wasn't new to being dismissed, to being treated as something lesser, but there was something especially cruel about having it done so publicly, with the world watching and doing nothing. Heather didn't expect her to respond. That was the best part. Rosalind wouldn't fight back, wouldn't demand respect, wouldn't cause a scene. She would sit there and absorb it, and Heather would walk away victorious. She had done it before, and she would do it again. The plane began to taxi slowly, the hum of the engines a steady vibration beneath their feet. The tension in Rosalind's body had begun to turn into exhaustion, the emotional weight bearing down on her frail frame. Her mouth felt dry, and she reached out hesitantly for the small plastic cup of water on the tray in front of her, careful not to make any sudden movements that might draw more unwanted attention. Heather, still lingering nearby, caught the motion out of the corner of her eye. A slow, devious smile tugged at her lips as she took a step closer, her shadow casting over the old woman's withered hands. Rosalind barely had time to steady the cup before Heather reached forward with exaggerated clumsiness, knocking into the tray with just enough force to send the water sloshing over the edge. The liquid splashed across Rosalind's lap, cold and jarring, soaking into the thin fabric of her dress before she could even react. "Oh no," Heather gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in a mock display of shock. "I didn't even see that there. My hands must have slipped. How terrible." Her eyes gleamed with unrepentant amusement as she straightened, stepping back just enough to allow the other passengers a full view of the spreading dampness across Rosalind's lap. A chuckle came from somewhere behind them, low and mean, accompanied by the barely contained snickering of a few others who had been watching the scene unfold. Heather sighed, shaking her head. "I really should be more careful," she said, her voice carrying just the right amount of performative guilt. But honestly, it's not like she could have moved out of the way in time, anyway. Rosalind's entire body locked up, her breath coming in shallow, measured inhales, the coolness of the water nothing compared to the burning humiliation now crawling up her skin. Heather had taken everything from her in this moment, her dignity, her composure, the last shred of self-respect she had fought so hard to maintain. Heather gave one final, satisfied glance before casually reaching into the overhead compartment and retrieving a small stack of napkins. With exaggerated slowness, she placed them down in front of Rosalind, the condescension in her expression sharp enough to cut. "Here you go," she murmured, leaning in just enough so that only Rosalind could hear. "Clean yourself up. You look like a mess." Rosalind stared at the napkins, at the crumpled white squares mocking her from the tray table, and in that moment, she felt smaller than she ever had before. The laughter around her faded into white noise, the voices blending together in a way that felt distant, disconnected, like she wasn't truly there. Her hands, still damp, rested limply in her lap as she forced herself to swallow the lump in her throat. Heather, satisfied with her work, finally turned on her heel and strolled down the aisle. The damp fabric of Rosalind's dress clung uncomfortably to her fragile frame, the cold sensation seeping into her skin long after the laughter had died down. Heather had moved on, tending to other passengers with the same performative charm that masked her cruelty, but the weight of her presence lingered like an oppressive shadow. Rosalind sat motionless, her gaze unfocused, her hands resting limply on her lap as the humiliations stacked upon her like bricks, each one heavier than the last. The murmur of conversation around her blurred into a dull hum, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter or the clinking of glasses, all of it serving as a cruel reminder that life continued effortlessly for everyone else while she sat there, stripped of any remaining dignity. Heather returned with a feigned look of concern, a fresh layer of artificial politeness coating her words, as she leaned down toward Rosalind with an exaggerated sigh. "You know, I've been thinking," she mused, placing a hand on the seat in front of the elderly woman, as if they were old friends sharing a quiet conversation. "Maybe first class just isn't the right fit for you after all. I mean, it's all about comfort here, and I just don't think this arrangement is really working, do you?" Her voice was light, playful even, but there was no mistaking the edge beneath it. Rosalind stiffened, her fingers curling slightly as she braced herself for whatever came next. Before she could protest, Heather straightened, stepping back and gesturing toward the aisle with a casual wave of her hand. "Luckily, I've found a solution. There's a much better spot for you in the back where you'll have more privacy." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I think it'll be a better experience for everyone." The words were deliberate, carefully chosen, designed to make it clear that everyone would be better off if she simply disappeared. Rosalind hesitated, her chest tightening with a mix of shame and dread. But before she could say anything, Heather reached for the armrest and tilted the seat forward just enough to unsettle her balance, forcing Rosalind to reactively grab onto the nearest surface to steady herself. "Let's not take all day," Heather chirped, stepping aside as if she had just done something helpful, as if she weren't in the process of actively uprooting an elderly woman from her rightful seat. The walk to the back of the plane felt endless, each step heavy with exhaustion, each stare digging into her skin like tiny needles. The passengers who had laughed before now looked away, some out of discomfort, others simply unwilling to get involved. Even Mia, the younger flight attendant who had looked hesitant earlier, kept her head down, avoiding Rosalind's gaze as she passed. Heather led her all the way to the last row, stopping beside a seat directly adjacent to the restroom. The narrow space was confining, the proximity to the lavatory ensuring a steady stream of foot traffic, and the unavoidable scent of antiseptic mixed with something sour and unpleasant. Heather gestured dramatically toward the seat, the smirk never leaving her face. "Here we are," she announced. "Nice and close to the restroom in case you need it." Rosalind lowered herself slowly into the seat, her movements mechanical, her body resigned to the ceaseless degradation. Heather watched her with quiet satisfaction before leaning in one last time, lowering her voice just enough so that only Rosalind could hear. "See?" she whispered. "Now no one has to look at you." The finality of the words settled deep, pressing against Rosalind's chest like a weight she couldn't lift. Heather straightened, adjusting her uniform as she turned on her heel and strode away without a second glance. Time blurred into a haze of discomfort, the droning of the engines a distant hum as Rosalind sat in suffocating stillness, her surroundings fading into the background as exhaustion pulled at the edges of her consciousness. Minutes, or maybe hours, passed before she stirred slightly, a dull ache radiating from her lower back as she shifted in her seat, suddenly aware of an urgent pressure building in her bladder. She ignored it at first, unwilling to move, unwilling to draw attention to herself again, but the discomfort grew insistent, and finally, with great reluctance, she reached for her walker and slowly began to push herself up. The aisle was narrow, the distance to the restroom only a few feet, but every step felt heavier than the last. As she reached for the door handle, a shadow loomed beside her, and she turned just in time to see Heather stepping directly into her path, blocking the entrance with a casual stance, her arms crossed over her chest. Heather tilted her head, eyes glinting with something close to amusement. "And where do you think you're going?" Rosalind swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet Heather's gaze despite the exhaustion weighing her down. "I need to use the restroom," she said quietly, her voice hoarse from disuse. Heather's lips curled into a smirk as she glanced at the restroom door, then back at Rosalind. "Oh, I don't think so," she said smoothly. "See, this lavatory is reserved for the passengers who actually paid for their seats. You understand, right?" She tapped a finger against her chin as if considering something. "But if you really need to go that badly, I suppose you could wait until the flight attendants finish service. Of course, that might take a while." Rosalind's stomach twisted, the discomfort in her bladder now overshadowed by the growing realization that Heather had no intention of letting her pass. She opened her mouth to protest, but the smirk on Heather's face made it clear that no argument would be entertained, no plea would be considered. A passenger nearby cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his seat as if debating whether or not to intervene, but the moment his gaze met Heather's, he quickly looked away, feigning indifference. Heather took a step closer, lowering her voice into something almost conspiratorial. "Or," she said softly, "you could always just hold it." The words hung between them, dripping with cruelty, a challenge that she knew Rosalind had no choice but to accept. Rosalind inhaled sharply, her hands tightening around the handles of her walker as she forced herself to turn away, retreating back to her seat in silent defeat. Heather watched her go, satisfaction flickering in her eyes, before she turned and strolled down the aisle as if nothing had happened. The dull throbbing in her bladder refused to subside, but the humiliation of being turned away from a lavatory had settled deeper, intertwining itself with the exhaustion that pressed heavily against her frail frame. She stared at the seat back in front of her, forcing herself to remain still, to disappear, to become so insignificant that Heather would grow bored and move on. But Heather was far from done. Heather's heels clicked sharply against the floor as she made her way back down the aisle, her expression one of practiced politeness, the same plastic smile in place as she leaned slightly toward the flight manager, a man in his mid-50s with graying hair and a tired look that suggested he'd long since learned to pick his battles. "I just want to give you a heads up," Heather murmured, her voice just low enough to feign discretion, but loud enough that nearby passengers could overhear. "The woman in the last row, she's been a bit difficult. I don't want to cause unnecessary trouble, but if she keeps making a fuss, we might have to consider an early landing for safety reasons." The words sent a ripple of tension through the surrounding passengers. A young woman seated a few rows ahead frowned slightly, glancing over her shoulder toward the back of the plane as if trying to assess the supposed disturbance herself. An older man in a business suit, already irritable from the delays, let out a quiet groan and muttered, "For God's sake, can't she just sit quietly?" Heather turned to him with a sympathetic look, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I know, right? Some people just don't understand how to be considerate." Rosalind's breath caught in her throat as she heard the murmurs growing, the subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere making it clear that, without ever saying a word, Heather had successfully turned her into the problem. She wanted to protest, to tell them that she hadn't done anything, but the weight of every humiliation she had endured since stepping onto the plane pressed down harder, suffocating her. Heather straightened, smoothing down the front of her uniform as she made her way toward Rosalind's seat once more, her smile widening just enough to let the venom seep through. "Ma'am," she said sweetly, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "I just need to check in with you real quick. I really hope we won't have any more disturbances for the remainder of the flight." Rosalind looked up, her lips parting slightly as if to respond, but before she could say anything, Heather reached down and adjusted the small airline-issued blanket draped across her lap with a slow, deliberate movement, her nails just barely grazing the damp fabric of Rosalind's skirt. "You're not too uncomfortable back here, are you?" Heather asked, tilting her head in mock concern. "I mean, it's not first class, but at least this way you won't be in anyone's way." A few passengers chuckled softly, and Heather let the moment linger before stepping back, turning just enough so that her voice carried as she spoke to no one in particular. "We really should be more careful about seating arrangements in the future," she mused. "First class is supposed to be about a certain image, after all. We wouldn't want to lower the standard." A man seated near the middle of the plane scoffed in agreement. "Exactly," he muttered. "People pay thousands of dollars for those seats. Can't have just anyone sitting there." Heather gave a satisfied nod before looking back at Rosalind, as if daring her to contradict any of it. But Rosalind didn't move, didn't speak, didn't do anything but sit there, shoulders slightly hunched, hands trembling faintly against her lap. Heather's smirk widened. "Good," she murmured under her breath. "Now you're learning." The weight of exhaustion pressed into her bones, a heaviness that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the relentless degradation she had endured since stepping onto the plane. Heather Vaughn had won. She had stripped away every last shred of dignity Rosalind had clung to, reducing her to nothing more than a burden, a problem, an inconvenience best ignored. Heather, moving with effortless confidence through the aisle, finally made her way back toward the rear of the plane, her smile saccharine, her presence like a cold shadow stretching long over the elderly woman. She stopped just beside Rosalind's seat, tilting her head slightly as if appraising something insignificant. "You know," she mused, her voice low but loud enough for those nearby to hear, "some people might say you're lucky. Most airlines would have kicked someone like you off the plane before takeoff. Safety regulations and all that." She let the words settle, Let the meaning sink in before leaning down, her voice dropping into something resembling mock sympathy. "So really, you should be grateful we let you stay at all." The words cut deeper than any of the others. They weren't just cruel. They were a confirmation of what Heather had spent the entire flight forcing Rosalind to believe, that she didn't belong, that she wasn't wanted, that her very existence was something to be tolerated rather than respected. A soft gasp of indignation came from a passenger a few rows ahead, but it was quickly swallowed by the overwhelming silence of complicity. No one challenged Heather. No one spoke up. Rosalind's lips parted slightly, her breath catching in her throat as the crushing weight of powerlessness settled fully upon her. Her vision blurred, the sting in her eyes becoming unbearable as her chest tightened with a raw, aching pain she hadn't felt in years. A lifetime of swallowing her pride, of enduring with quiet resilience, of never causing a scene. It all collapsed under the sheer force of the humiliation pressing against her from all sides. Her hands trembled, her fingers gripping the thin airline blanket as if it were the only thing tethering her to the moment. But the dam had already broken. A choked sob escaped her lips before she could stop it, a sound so quiet, so fragile, that for a moment it seemed to go unnoticed. But then her shoulders shook and the tears fell, and suddenly there was no containing it. Heather's smile didn't falter. If anything, it widened. Rosalind raised a trembling hand to her face, desperate to wipe away the evidence of her breaking. But it was too late. The floodgates had opened, and the tears came freely now, silent and unrelenting, streaking down her weathered cheeks as she bowed her head in quiet surrender. Heather let out a small hum of satisfaction, tapping her fingers against the seatback as if contemplating something. Then, with one final smirk, she straightened, stepping back with an air of feigned politeness. "Well," she said breezily, "I'm glad we're all on the same page." Heather had not returned to her since delivering her last verbal blow, but she didn't need to. The damage had been done, and Heather had won. Or at least, that's what she thought. The plane touched down with a gentle thud, the long-awaited moment of escape arriving at last. But there was no relief, no sense of reprieve, only the cold, dull ache of knowing that it wouldn't matter. Nothing would change. The world had allowed this to happen, and it would allow it to happen again. Passengers stirred, stretching and retrieving their belongings, but the weight of what had transpired still lingered thick in the air, unspoken yet suffocating. Rosalind remained seated, her frail hands gripping the armrests, as she tried to summon the strength to stand, to move, to disappear before anyone else could look at her with either pity or disgust. But before she could push herself up, movement near the front of the cabin made her pause. The flight door had opened, but instead of just the usual crew, a man in a dark tailored suit stepped inside, his presence commanding in a way that instantly drew attention. Heather, standing near the exit, brightened at the sight of the new arrival, her trained hospitality instinct kicking in as she prepared to greet what she assumed was a high-priority passenger or an executive doing a routine check. "Welcome aboard, sir," she said smoothly, flashing her best professional smile. "We're just finishing up disembarking, but if there's anything I can..." She cut herself off as the man's piercing gaze locked onto her, his expression unreadable, but undeniably cold. "Where is she?" His voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable authority that sent a ripple of unease through the crew. Heather blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. "I'm sorry, sir, but who?" The elderly woman. His eyes swept the cabin once before settling on the back row, where Rosalind sat frozen in place. His jaw tightened, and without another word, he strode forward, the sound of his polished shoes against the cabin floor the only noise in the stunned silence that had fallen over the passengers. Heather remained standing, confusion flickering across her face before something colder settled in, a creeping realization that she had no control over whatever was happening. She turned toward the other flight attendants, but they were just as lost as she was, exchanging uncertain glances, their professional facades cracking under the weight of the unknown. The man reached Rosalind's row and stopped, his sharp, assessing gaze softening just slightly as he took in the sight before him. The damp patches on her dress, the way her frail shoulders curled inward as if trying to make herself as small as possible, the quiet devastation still lingering in her tear-reddened eyes. Rosalind slowly looked up, recognition flickering across her face, followed immediately by a surge of something unreadable: relief, shame, and something deeper, something rooted in decades of silence. The man inhaled slowly before turning back toward Heather, his expression now an icy mask of barely restrained fury. "Tell me," he said, his voice deceptively even, "did you personally decide to treat her like this, or is this standard protocol for your crew?" Heather stiffened, something deep in her instincts screaming at her to choose her words carefully. But years of unchecked arrogance had ingrained in her a reflexive need to defend herself. "Sir, do you even know who she is?" He didn't raise his voice, but somehow it carried through the entire cabin, the intensity behind it more suffocating than a shout ever could be. Heather faltered, her carefully crafted demeanor beginning to crack under the weight of his gaze. "She's just a passenger," she said, but the words sounded weak even to her own ears. The man let out a quiet, humorless laugh, shaking his head as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Then he turned to the stunned passengers, his voice carrying a biting edge that cut through the air like steel. "This woman," he said, gesturing toward Rosalind, "is Rosalind Mercer." He let the name settle, watching as confusion rippled through the faces around him before finally landing his gaze back on Heather, eyes now burning with undisguised contempt. "She is one of the founding investors of this airline. She is the reason this company exists." A heavy, deafening silence fell over the cabin. Heather's breath hitched, her brain scrambling to process what she had just heard, her mind rejecting the implications even as they became impossible to deny. Her voice failed her, her throat suddenly dry. "This woman," the man continued, "has spent decades ensuring that thousands of employees, people like you, have jobs. She personally funded initiatives to improve airline hospitality, to create accessibility for passengers who need extra care. And you?" His voice darkened, low and dangerous. "You humiliated her. You degraded her. You treated her like she was less than nothing." Heather felt her knees threaten to give out, her carefully controlled world spiraling out of her grasp. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her now, but the amusement from earlier had vanished. In its place was something colder: disgust, horror, and worst of all, recognition. The man exhaled, running a hand down his face as if forcing himself to remain calm before leveling his final blow. "And you did all of this," he said, his voice razor-sharp, "to your own employer's mother." Heather's heart stopped. Rosalind Mercer, the frail old woman she had spent the entire flight humiliating, tormenting, breaking, was the mother of Lawrence Monroe, the CEO and majority shareholder of the airline. The breath whooshed out of Heather's lungs as the full weight of her actions crashed down on her. The power she had wielded so effortlessly, the cruel confidence she had relished, evaporated in an instant. Passengers stared at her in open shock, the pieces falling into place, the shift in atmosphere as sudden and violent as turbulence. The very people who had laughed along with her earlier now leaned away, as if her downfall might be contagious. Heather's pulse pounded in her ears as Lawrence Monroe's words settled over the cabin like a suffocating weight, each syllable cutting through the manufactured confidence she had spent years perfecting. The passengers who had once laughed along with her now stared as if she were something vile, something contaminated, something doomed. Her breath came in shallow, rapid bursts as the enormity of her mistake became painfully, irrevocably clear. She had spent the entire flight degrading, humiliating, and tormenting the matriarch of the very company that signed her paychecks, and there was no undoing it. The silence was shattered by the sharp click of heels against the floor, followed by the unmistakable presence of airport security officers stepping onto the plane, their movements swift and purposeful, their expressions unreadable. Heather stiffened, her body instinctively tensing as one of the officers, a broad-shouldered man with a stoic demeanor, came to stand directly beside her. "Heather Vaughn?" The officer's voice was neutral, but the underlying authority made Heather's stomach drop. She forced herself to straighten, grasping onto the last remnants of her pride as she met his gaze. "Yes," she replied, her voice quieter than she had intended. The officer didn't blink. "You are hereby detained for investigation regarding multiple complaints of passenger mistreatment, abuse of authority, and discriminatory behavior on board Flight 407, he stated flatly, his words carrying the weight of an unchallengeable verdict. A sharp gasp rippled through the passengers as reality snapped into place. Heather wasn't just losing her job. She was facing legal consequences. Her hands instinctively clenched into fists as her mind scrambled for some kind of response, some way to salvage what little she had left. But before she could even part her lips, the officer produced a pair of stainless steel handcuffs and snapped them tightly around her wrists. Heather let out a strangled noise, half protest, half disbelief, her carefully composed mask crumbling into sheer panic. "Wait, no," she started, but the officer gripped her arm firmly, his hold unyielding as he turned her toward the exit. A murmur of stunned whispers swept through the cabin, passengers twisting in their seats to watch the once dominant flight attendant now being forcibly led away like a common criminal. Lawrence Monroe didn't so much as glance at her. His attention remained fixed on his mother, his expression unreadable as he knelt beside Rosalind's seat, his voice dropping into something far more tender, something entirely unfamiliar to Heather. "Mom," he murmured, his hand hovering near Rosalind's fragile fingers, hesitant, almost uncertain. Rosalind finally lifted her gaze, her tear-rimmed eyes meeting her son's, and for the first time since stepping onto the plane, the sorrow in her expression softened into something else, not relief, not triumph, but a quiet, exhausted resignation. Heather barely registered the shutter clicks of multiple phone cameras capturing her downfall, but within seconds, social media exploded. The video clips surfaced instantly. Heather mocking Rosalind, Heather dumping water on her, Heather sneering, Heather smirking, Heather gloating as she drove an elderly woman to tears. The hashtags appeared within minutes. Hashtag Heather the Heartless, hashtag Cruel Skies, hashtag Justice for Rosalind. As the officers led her off the plane, the murmurs turned into outright condemnation. "Disgusting," someone muttered under their breath. "I hope she never works again," another whispered, their voice filled with undisguised contempt. A young woman near the exit locked eyes with Heather as she passed, shaking her head in silent disgust before raising her phone to capture one final shot of the disgraced flight attendant in handcuffs. Heather Vaughn stepped off the plane with handcuffs digging into her wrists, each step dragging under the crushing weight of her downfall, each stare piercing through her like a blade, each phone capturing her disgrace from every angle. The colleagues who had once laughed alongside her now stood aside, their faces blank, their bodies rigid with a silent message. She was no longer one of them. The junior flight attendant she had once belittled turned away the moment their eyes met. A businessman who had chuckled at her jokes now sighed in disapproval. A passenger who had smirked at Rosalind's suffering shook his head as if disgusted by himself for ever finding Heather amusing. The realization clawed at her insides. No one would stand by her now. Everyone else would step off this plane and forget about her within hours, pushing her to the back of their minds like yesterday's news. But she would have to live with this forever. Security officers led her through the crowded airport, where spectators had already gathered, where news screens played live footage of the scandal she had become, where strangers whispered with barely concealed amusement and revulsion, where phones were raised to record her descent into disgrace. A middle-aged man scoffed as he hit record. A woman muttered to her companion that Heather deserved every second of this. A group of teenagers laughed as they scrolled through Twitter, watching as her name became a viral sensation, a cautionary tale spreading faster than wildfire. Heather was shoved into a small interrogation room, the suffocating silence pressing in on her. No cameras, no spectators, just four walls and the cold realization that she was alone in a way she had never been before. A security officer tossed a stack of papers onto the table in front of her. Official documents listing the charges against her, an email from upper management confirming her immediate termination, screenshots of social media posts filled with hundreds of thousands of comments calling for her to be blacklisted from the airline industry forever, news articles branding her as the most disgraceful flight attendant in history. Heather gripped the edges of the chair, her nails digging into the material, her chest tightening as the walls seemed to close in around her. There was no escaping it. This was the end. The door swung open, and the rhythmic click of shoes against the tile floor made her stomach lurch. Heather lifted her head, and there, standing before her, was Rosalind Mercer, the woman she had spent an entire flight humiliating, tormenting, and breaking. Heather's breath caught in her throat as she took in the stark contrast between them now. The frail old woman standing tall in quiet dignity, while she, Heather Vaughn, sat shackled, powerless, and ruined. Rosalind stepped closer, stopping just inches away, her face unreadable, neither angry nor triumphant. Heather wanted to look away, wanted to shrink into nothing, but something in Rosalind's eyes held her in place, forcing her to endure every agonizing second of her own disgrace. And then, when she finally spoke, her voice was not filled with hatred or vengeance, but with the kind of sorrow that only comes from having suffered too much for too long. Now, do you understand what it feels like to be discarded? Heather didn't answer. She couldn't. She just sat there, bound by the consequences she had so carelessly brought upon herself, swallowed whole by the unbearable silence of a life that could never be put back together. As Rosalind turned and walked away, leaving her behind, Heather realized there was nothing left to say. No apology could undo what she had done. No plea for forgiveness could erase what she had become. There was no way back. The end. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another gripping tale like this. What part shocked you the most? Was it when Heather completely lost control, or when Rosalind revealed who she really was? And where are you watching from? Comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts.